Hello, I'm Toycat, and today I'd like to give an update to the war in Ukraine because Russia has been making some pretty concerning comments about it, something they've been able to do because the US's attention is now elsewhere. Why Venezuela? Well, I couldn't possibly say, but what I can say is that the US usually can fight multiple conflicts at the same time, but in this case it's not just rhetoric, it's backed up by the fact that the US and the European institutions used to roughly back Ukraine 50-50, but this funding really started to stall in 2023, and as of 2025 it's dropped to nearly nothing, leaving European countries to come together and work out what to do, which is why it's interesting that in that response, Belgium is being described as Russia's most valuable asset and the biggest handbrake on doing that. And it's interesting because usually if you look at European countries, the ones that are furthest away from Russia, take the UK and Norway, are the ones that are easiest to take a hardline stance against it. They've just formed a naval alliance and we could pat ourselves on the back for that. But the truth is, as you get closer to Russia, the need to actually negotiate with them and the need to have a better relationship with them is important, which is why the peace plan here is so important. This is the thing you need to understand most of all. The US and Russia have been negotiating, without Europe involved notably, but what's interesting is they have been negotiating, and the leaked draft plan is super fascinating because there's 28 points to it, but most of them are not favorable to Ukraine. In other words, the US is saying we want this war over and we're willing to make a lot of concessions for that, and if we look at what those concessions are, you can see that, well, Ukraine gets their sovereignty being confirmed. That's nice, although it is just saying confirmed after a true fact. There would also be a total and comprehensive non-aggression agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe with robust or reliable security guarantees for Kyiv and also a demand for snap elections in 100 days. So in exchange for security guarantees, they have to hold an election and they have to have a non-aggression agreement, and also they have to hand over some territory. The entire war has basically been fought over these regions of Ukraine. Ukraine would have to give up everything that they've already lost, plus a little bit more to actually round out the oblasts, because in the first year there was a lot of like dynamic stuff happening in the fighting, territory going back and forth, but recently it's just been the same bits of territory losing 5 or 10% over the course of a day. So Ukraine would have to give up all of the territory that they've gained back since those areas were annexed. That is a pretty big ask, and also their forces would have to be limited to 600,000 personnel. In exchange, they would not be able to join NATO, but they would be able to join the EU with a short-term preferred market access, in other words, like EU membership light, and in exchange for all of those concessions Russia just made, which is joining the EU in the future, and also getting some territory, and also Ukraine having their sovereignty confirmed, Russia would be brought back into the fold internationally. They'd be able to join the G7 again. It'd have to be the G8, I guess, make space for Russia. Also, their frozen assets would come back, and this is notable because there is going to be a massive bill that's going to come from this. And ultimately, it's interesting because there is going to be a real problem because Russia has a decent amount of frozen assets, but nowhere near the cost of rebuilding Ukraine after this very expensive war. What's interesting, by the way, is if we look at these assets, they're held largely by Euroclear and Belgium, which is where Belgium comes into this story. Because, yeah, although this plan is definitely something that is controversial because of how many concessions it makes to Russia, what's notable is Russia came out and said, yeah, this is a great agreement, but we'd really like to see a lot more on our side, if we're being honest. They want even more from this agreement, and they're saying, look, right now, the 85% of the Donbass that we control, that territory I was talking about, actually, we're going to take the rest of it, so either we'll take it by force or Ukraine can stand by. We'd like to get it in a peace treaty, but otherwise, we'll go in there and get it done. This is a really interesting response, and to come back to this, we'll talk a little bit about how Belgium is really being the handbrake on Europe's response, because the European Union looks at this and says, yeah, this isn't okay. This whole agreement is very rough. I mean, the only real concession is that Ukraine can join the EU, which they probably could have done beforehand anyway. There's no real concessions from Russia. This is basically how much can we concede to Russia and what can we get in terms of security guarantees that they won't invade anymore. It's a very basically the agreement is we get to stop spending a 50 billion a year on funding the Ukraine war. That is the only real concession that's being offered, which is why European Union leaders met up and had the idea of let's have a little chat about how to do this. So this is the story Politico tells is that the EU leaders arrived for a summit in Brussels and they wanted to give a huge leader, and they were talking about themselves about how the money should be spent. France being France, thinks that Ukraine should only buy weapons made in Europe, while Finland, among others, said that Zelensky should be free to procure whatever kit they need from wherever they need to find it. In other words, like saying, how about if we're giving them money, we let them spend it in the best possible way rather than only on our own gear. But there was an agreement about what to do there, and then all of a sudden, Belgium came out and said, whoa, we're not going to use that money at all. You see, the interesting thing is that even though the European Union has plans to use these billions of euros from frozen Russian assets, Belgium doesn't really like this so much. Why is that the case? Because the frozen Russian funds held in Europe are all held in Belgium because of a service called Euroclear. Basically, if you look at the Euroclear is a Brussels-based financial clearinghouse, and it holds the bulk of Russian assets because it was meant to be that basically Brussels wanted to become this big financial power inside of the EU, and they're worried that they'll end up in litigation and that the action will harm Euroclear's reputation and business model. In other words, if they are seen as a bank that will take your money and use it to finance wars against yourself, a lot of countries are going to say, ooh, if there's even a tiny chance that we ever have a war of Europe, maybe we shouldn't go there, or maybe even just if there's a tiny chance the world could be against us, let's not store our money in that bank. It's the same way if you ever see banks close down your account because you're into Bitcoin, or they close down your account because you withdraw too much money from it, and even though you assume that there's a good reason for them doing that, you've got to say like, yeah, I don't want to bank with anyone who will take my money away because I'm putting my money in the bank because it's my money. So basically, Belgium is saying, look, we're not going to do this. We have sometimes frozen assets in previous conflicts. This is already quite a big move, but we're not going to take that money and use it to fund Ukraine. Because to be fair, there is actually more of a plan than that. The basic idea is that the European Union has spent more than 170 billion euros, and basically to fund the rest of these, they could take these Russian assets, spend them on the war in Ukraine, and then when Ukraine gets their peace deal, which will come with actual reparations, there's a giant bill coming out for that, and then that loan could be repaid, and then once Russia wants their money back, we could give them the money back from the money they're giving to Ukraine to fund the war. It actually makes some sense if you are 100% sure that the Ukraine war will end with reparations. In other words, pre-fund your war using the reparations that are coming because of how bad that war is. But yeah, it's quite a clever tactic, says Gregor Ruse. They're not seizing the asset, but they're keeping them frozen and monetizing them. But again, this is something that I think has some huge issues, and which is causing the big rift inside of the EU. Belgium believes that their reputation is important, and if they want to borrow all of this money, rather than creating some complicated scheme, why not instead just borrow from the markets? There is instead just use ordinary market borrowing. Loans exist. Get yourself a loan and then pay back that loan, and then if you happen to get the money back from Ukraine, you can do it that way. Rather than creating an extra step of volatility and extra harm to Belgium's business model, why not instead just do that? And I guess this is the big problem with what is happening between, again, the US and Europe. It seems as though, fascinatingly, the European Union should be more united in what's doing Ukraine, but the United States more or less was like, okay, let's fund this war, let's get some stuff done. But given the, and interestingly enough, if you actually look into it, the US was being far more generous in Ukraine by not just giving, aid, but actively giving, not just giving loans, which is a large part of it, but also giving out, as well as loans, actually giving grants. But what's interesting is that those grants are starting to dry up. Again, look at this aid yet to be allocated from this 2024 study. You can see that now it is the EU that has to work out what to do, and there's a lot of disagreement within the bloc. And I guess the reason why is because ultimately, Russia and Ukraine are all the way over there. The ultimate result now is, peace is the ultimate goal, but the only way to get peace right now would be a peace that isn't really ideal. If you wait for peace, it might be under even less favorable terms, and so ultimately it's kind of an interesting situation. You are presented with a bad deal, what do you do? And I think that this presents a real problem, and one that we can come into MS Paint for. Yeah, it's a classic. So I think you have three solutions if you are now Europe and you're taking over the financing of this war. You've got three basic ideas. The first one is what every voter would probably say, which is end the war, really good terms. So how do you end the war under the really good terms that you probably want, the really good terms that make Ukraine really happy, and that make international order make sense? Well, obviously, you would have to give back all of the territory that Russia has gained, all of this territory. You would have to then also give back Crimea. That was annexed in 2014. It's the reason Russia left the G7. And you would make Russia pay compensation for all that territory they've taken and for all the stuff they've destroyed. You make Russia rebuild because they're the ones who did the wrong thing. And then also you would make them give a guarantee that it would never happen again. That is the morally right thing to do, but there's a problem. Morally right, again, ultimately, there's an interesting argument. The morally right is really great and we can make it work, but this is really, really, really hard to get. If you want to end the war on really good terms, you would have to push the fight into Russia, which is a struggle not just because, like, ignoring the fact that we could send millions of European troops in there, ignore the fact that technically Russia could use nukes and that's a whole problem. Let's just say that Russia will agree to never, ever, ever do anything untoward, and that all you need to do is send enough money and enough soldiers into Ukraine, and you can eventually, have this exact same thing lined up. This is an expensive thing to do, therefore. You can't make Russia agree to these really good terms, and so you would have to force them to agree to these good terms by invading Russia and hoping for the best from that. So ending the war is a really good solution, but it's a bit of a problem-filled one. The other idea is to just say, end the war, any terms. This is basically the US proposal, where they're going in and they're making concessions on any point that Russia seems to be sticking to, and this is a problem because if you end the war on any terms, which is if you think about the morally right thing to do is fixing all of the damage that Russia has done to Ukraine, the pragmatically right thing to do would be prevent Russia from doing any more. If you concede that there is no way without spending a lot of money and a lot of human life fixing this, then you would say the correct third choice would be like, okay, let's just end the war right now and prevent any more harm from happening. The sunk cost fallacy says that we've spent 100 billion, you lose 50 billion gambling at the casino. Don't spend another 50 billion gambling so you can get that back, because you might lose that 50 billion too. In other words, don't send good money after bad. Don't send good soldiers after bad. I mean, it's not that they're bad soldiers, but don't send good soldiers after dead, I guess. Just because a bunch of people have died, it doesn't mean more people need to die. And just because a bunch of damage has been done, it doesn't mean more damage needs to be done. If the Ukraine war had stopped in 2022, even at these really unfavorable terms, at least a bunch of Ukrainian lives wouldn't be lost. At least a bunch more damage wouldn't have been done to these kind of middling villages, and Kiev would be actively rebuilding right now as opposed to still in a state of war. They would have a democratic government, etc. So this is the probably thing you could make happen right now. With enough negotiation with Russia, you'd probably have to make even more concessions based on the fact that, yeah, Russia's coming out and saying, yeah, as much as this agreement is basically everything we ever wanted, we still kind of want more. So how about we invade you to get that? So that's kind of those are the two extreme options, but they both seem very, very bad. You are rewarding Russia's bad behavior, and you probably should not do that. That's my hot take. So the ideal is you need to actually end the war somewhere in between these. Concede that the really good terms are going to be tricky to get, and the any terms are bad to get. And so a lot of European countries are saying, yeah, let's finance this war using Russian assets, because then Russia is losing money on both sides of the war. Rather than Russia right now, they're spending money and they're draining Ukraine's money, which is actively, when you really look at it, that's draining the US's and Europeans' money. If you force Russia to fight themselves, if you use Russian money to, like the medieval version of hiring sellswords, if you use Russian money against itself, then Russia would be far more inclined not to end the war on any terms, sure, but to get closer to ending the war on the terms you want. And this is the disagreement. How much harm is it worth? In other words, if there is a spectrum of war endings, and we really don't want we really want what's up here, but no, we can't get it. And we really don't want what's down here, but know that we can get it. How far up the spectrum can you move? How much does it take to get this ideal you can end the war right now and really good terms as close together as you can? Well, the answer is you make it as tricky for Russia to fight this war as possible. But the struggle is that we've already cut off Russia from every international market that I can imagine. We've already done so much harm to Russia. And is that a good way to build a future relationship? Even if you force Russia to agree somewhere in the middle here, but you do so in a way that really stings their population and builds everlasting resentment against Europe, is that a healthy way for the future? Or would you say, well, it's morally right? And that's where the trickiness lies. And that's why it is that, the UK and Norway are very clear about what they want to do. And that's why Belgium is saying something very different. They're saying, look, we can still spend a bunch of money on Ukraine, but let's not harm ourselves while we do this. And that's also arguably what the French are doing. If you think about it, by the French being like, we think that if we give Ukraine money, as a loan, by the way, as a loan, I think this is Jamaican, but I am sticking with it. If we give them money as a loan, they must buy our weapons with the money that we loan them, and then they must pay us back for the money. France is coming out with a pretty lame, thing in that level if you think about it. And this is the real struggle: is that every European country has slightly different goals. The further east you get, the more defensive, I guess, there is, and the further west you get, the more they're like, why are we spending money on this? If we're going to spend money, we should at least be boosting our defense industry, and such lies the problem. What is the solution going to be? Well, hopefully enough people get round a table for long enough, and there are enough serious threats being made that someone actually works out what's going down. But right now, I am predicting that there's going to be a series of stalemating happening here, and yeah, it's sad. It's a bummer. It seems as though this should be an easily solvable problem by everyone working out where their line is between these two things, and everyone coming to find that perfect agreement. But the struggle is in how far should you push, what human toll and what cost to your economy and to your the world order, I guess you could say. Is it worth doing to get towards the really good terms from a European perspective? I guess, funnily enough, if you think about this on the reverse term, Russia has this on the inverse. They can end the war on any terms right now by giving everything back to Ukraine, but then all of their soldiers will have died for nothing. And they could also end the war on really good terms, which is they get more from Ukraine, they get a buffer zone, they get basically the right to invade more of Ukraine in the future, and they would get to pick their own Ukrainian president. He'd have to, before the current Ukrainian guy, the presidents in Ukraine used to be very, very pro-Russia. It was a big problem. And so maybe they could get going back to a system like that. That would be their ideal. And so Russia also has to work out how many of our men are worth losing so that we can get closer to the good terms, when really the any term solution, it kind of works out for them. So it's an interesting thing about any negotiation, is the ideal is you would find somewhere between both. But it sucks that somewhere between both means giving Russia anything in exchange for bad behavior, right? It'd be like if someone committed a murder and you're like, oh, yeah, instead of sending you to prison, we'll give you £5 million not to commit a murder again. And it's like, whoa, let's not incentivize murder. But we have to incentivize, or we have to incentivize the ending of the war, even if it seems like we're accidentally incentivizing the start. Or do we? Some people disagree. I certainly think this is a tricky one, because you do have to say there is a huge cost, and I don't like human cost. I don't want people to die, but a lot of people would say, well, people have died, and let's make their sacrifice worth something, which is a slippery slope that humans get down and which leads to much bigger scary things. But I'll leave you with that one today. I hope that one day, 100 years in the future, Russia has a super democratic government, and we're all laughing about this, but I think it will take a long time to get to that point. And, maybe not ever. Maybe the concept of the world economy just fails. Maybe there will never be a concept. Maybe the only reason we can have an international collection of countries in Europe, maybe the thing that really unites the rest of the EU together is Russia's existence. It's an interesting thing to think about. But for now, I hope you all enjoy this video, because second channel, don't care. Goodbye. Oh, also, give me money on Patreon. Look at that. We got another one. Someone, this is Graphtreon. It's a website that lets you see how good you are at Patreon. And look at that. You can see that we actually just went, we went down. Never mind. But there is a new paid member. Isn't that exciting? You can give me money and I'll use it for kebabs. That's my pitch. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.